Hey everybody, it's Dimitri Bilg here, and I wanted to talk today about this question: how much emotion in a healing process is the right amount? Now, back in the old days, I remember countless times of seeing this, and this is, by the way, I think, do not do this. That say we'd have a guy and he'd be getting angry about something he was angry. He was setting a boundary with some sort of voice in his life that needed a boundary set with it. So he'd be pounding on like, rolled up futon with a tennis racket and yelling and getting angrier and angrier and angrier. It's like just like out of his mind with anger, right? And then the facilitator would say, "You're at 10%." And we'd use like this percent thing. And it would be very, very demanding. And what would often happen would be eventually the guy would just give up. He'd go from trying. He'd be completely losing his mind with anger and rage and out of his mind. And they'd say, "Oh, you're at 10%." And what would happen is he'd have learned helplessness, right? So there's no way for me to win this. No matter how much I do, I can't win. And when a person decides that, they give up. All right, this is kind of entirely what my entire business on this planet is about. It's helping people who've given up, who've decided that what they do doesn't matter. So we would inadvertently teach these guys, it doesn't matter what you do, you can never get mad enough to win. And that was bad. So just so you know how to set that up, every time you do anger work with someone, you need to set up a way for them to win. So it might be, and it's a way that they can measure as they go. This isn't really what this video is going to be about, but I want to make sure to touch on this. So if they're getting angry, say if they're pounding on something, they need to have the person they're mad at across from them and to the side a little bit, slowly kind of like falling down, falling down, so they can judge how far they are towards getting done. Or if they're yelling somebody out of the room, they need to see how far they've gotten. You can even stop them and say, "Hey, look at how far you've come. You've done this. You're in your power. You have the capacity to set this boundary," right? Rather than just pound and yell and pound and yell and pound and yell and pound and yell, and nothing happens, and you're told you're at 10% and you give up. So a lot of that is certainly in the old days of my experience in this work, late 80s, early 90s, stuff like that. We had a very high standard for how much emotion was enough emotion. How much emotion should you go for before you accept that the person is actually touching a real feeling, is actually really touching their power? How much anger should you demand that they reveal before you allow the person they're yelling out of the room to move? How much crying are you going to accept? Is it going to take for you to really believe that they're feeling compassion for some part of themselves or are experiencing some sort of grief? How much emotion is actually enough? And I feel like I've seen for a bazillion years, facilitators get wound up on the axle of this by feeling like they haven't really got it. I remember early on, there was a guy who was doing some grief work in a process. He was holding someone who was a piece of himself that needed love, but he wasn't crying. And the other facilitators and I were kind of talking. We're like, we're of two minds of this. On the one hand, he seems to really be in a feeling. On the other hand, he's not crying. How is this even acceptable if he's not crying? And so we had to start looking at this possibility that maybe not everybody's emotional experience is the same, and maybe not everybody has to reveal it to the same extent. So here's what I ended up doing. I started experimenting with, especially like anger work. How much anger do they really need to show in order to have a transformation? And I found that, generally speaking, about 1/10 of the amount of anger that, like in our men's weekends and stuff like that we normally expect, is generally speaking enough to really set a boundary. And sometimes when people are deep into like a blessing emotion, they're not crying, they're just very still. And you don't have to worry about that. You can accept that may be the way that person does that. And if they tell you, "I'm stuck, I'm not feeling anything," then you need to deal with that. But if they're just like silent and in themselves but not crying, that's fine, I feel like this idea that you have to emote to a really high degree it messes with facilitators, it messes with people. Like occasionally I'll meet a guy, he says, "My problem is I don't cry. I never really cry." Like, okay, do you feel like there's something pent up inside of you that needs to be let out? They're like, "No, it's just everybody else cries. I feel like I should cry." Well, here's what you need to be looking for with emotions. You want people to be authentic and congruent. They don't need to be crazy. They don't need to be wailing. They don't need to be screaming. I like to say they need to be contacting the emotion. They don't need to be wallowing in it. They just need to be contacting it. If they're fully facing it and they've got that kind of like metaphorically have their hands on it and they're honestly getting that they feel this way. And if they're congruent, I would rather have somebody be congruent and authentic with the smallest amount of anger than just terrorize and not really doing anything, but screaming. So congruence, authenticity, we want them to contact the emotion. They don't need to wallow in it. Sometimes it's good, but it's not. That doesn't need to be your goal. Are they being authentic? And one way in which this has really served me is, I do a lot more work on the phone now, and there have been a lot of people who've tried to kind of do carpet work type work on the phone. And it took me a long time of experimenting with this and learning from people and stuff to do this. Because we'd say, all right, let's try and do like some anger work on the phone. Or, let's try and do some grief work on the phone. And we'd want to get them in big emotions, and that just really doesn't work. Having a lot of different parts out, if you're counseling someone on the phone, doesn't work that well. But a lot of the reason we're driving for that is because we want to get these big emotional breakthroughs, which you don't actually need. All you need is for them to contact the emotion, to authentically get that it's there, and the ability to move the next step in their healing process will be available for them. So that's it for today. I'll talk to you all tomorrow. Feel free to share this or tell Facebook you want to be notified when I come on if you want to, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.